Mike's on, we're about ready to get started. First of all, thanks to everybody that came out today. Overcast day, there's all kinds of things you could be doing. Y'all could be watching baseball, watching the World Cup. You could be at home reading, you could be streaming something on Netflix, but you chose to be here with us. Augustus and I appreciate it. And second disclaimer, some of y'all know I did promise sweets because my sister is a pastry chef and she was going to come through, but she's also a fitness instructor. She had a class tonight. So the sweet potato toaster pastries, we don't call them Pop-Tarts because we don't want to get sued. They gotta wait till next time. But again, welcome to this event. We're calling it Living with Music, Black Writers on Black Music. Was born in the Instagram DMs. This event, we were just DMing back and forth, and I said, hey, you reference Living with Music, that collection of essays, I reference it in my book, why don't we do something together? So for folks that are brand new here, I am Morgan Campbell, but sorry, I'm going to introduce my co-presenter first. Now, yes, he's a professor at the University of Toronto. What exactly is it that you teach? You teach a lot of English. He's an English professor, but he also teaches an entire course on D'Angelo's voodoo. Sorry, the second time we made that mistake, right, on D'Angelo's Black Messiah. Here's the thing. He first came across my Instagram feed about a year and a half ago because he's having a book launch right here. And the book is when you see in front of you, Stay Black and Die. Now, for those of you that don't know, my family is African American. My mom and my dad are both from the south side of Chicago. Their folks are from various points across the South. We are very much just a mainstream African American family. There's happens to be a branch of us up here. Now, I have to say this. A lot of Canadians of all colors have some type of familiarity with Black American culture. Most of it comes from pop culture, hip-hop music, whatever. And so you'll hear people, pepper their speech with some African Americanisms. So, I didn't necessarily think twice about Augustus Durham, but being an African American, but when I saw the title of the book was Stay Black and Die, that's a phrase that you are not going to get just from watching sitcoms, right? If you know what that means, and if you know if you know the call that usually precedes that response, right? If you're someone that's been immersed in African American culture, so that was my first clue that Augustus Durham was a real life African American, not just a Canadian borrowing from the culture. So all I have to say this: brilliant guy. I'm proud and I'm thrilled to present with him. If you guys get a chance, read Stay Black and Die. I will issue this warning, and I know you guys will get the reference because a bunch of black book nerds here. It's a little bit like Soul on Ice in the sense that you got to keep your dictionary with you when you read it, because you'll learn a lot of new words. But he is a brilliant scholar, next level thinker. Everybody welcome Augustus Durham.
Hey. Thank you all so much. So in introducing Morgan, I'm going to do it in kind of like a bit of a double way, probably because I am a scholar. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to read his bio at the back of the book, but then I'm going to add something personal. Morgan Campbell is an award-winning journalist, currently a senior contributor at CBC Sports, and contributed to the New York Times. For over 18 years, he worked at the Toronto Star, where he established himself as one of Canada's finest sports writers. Morgan's best work highlights the places where sport intersects with off-the-field issues like race, culture, politics, and business. So that's like the business part. I find, just in terms of our communications, that Morgan has been very, very open and very, very welcoming, particularly given that you don't have to do a book event with me, right? And especially given that we're kind of doing this event with the merger of two worlds.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I thought was really intriguing, and what I want to give him credit for as we begin to think about this conversation, is that in a very kind of scary, perhaps even eerie way, this book that is not about me actually, in some ways, maps onto my own life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read something that Morgan wrote as a way of introducing him, and then read something that I wrote so you all can see what I'm getting at. On page 213, I'm going to read the whole paragraph. But the end of every game meant seeing the other players with their parents. The bubble burst and current circumstances flooded back in. Not just trying to continue without my dad, my anchor, my armor, but the burden is death dumped on my mom, and the way all three of my living grandparents vanished. The problem wasn't just my dad's absence, but the presence of tension between my family's factions. Grief and conflict occupied space in my brain, competed for it. I didn't feel empty in the moments after games. When I looked for my dad on the sidelines, I felt heavy. That autumn, I grew used to losing, but I never adjusted to loss. That's Morgan. This is what I wrote in my book in 2023. Writing Stay Black and Die on Melancholy and Genius has been revelatory, namely the realizations, among others, that I have not only been melancholy for most of my life, how obvious, but I have also been in some state of mourning over the last 12 years, in particular a series of losses almost every spring during that period. Such confessions are not how I roll, let alone in a space like this where I have no control over who and how many people will read that admission. However, I want to begin these acknowledgments by thanking whomever or whatever has guided me thus far in the journey to now, and to say, albeit peculiarly, that I am proud of me for somehow waking up every morning over this long delay and working through catastrophe. That said, by acknowledging my melancholy and mourning, I take responsibility for bringing about those feelings in others. For those named and unnamed here, I apologize. I thought it was very, very scary. And again, very eerie that in some ways our lives are not going to each other. And so for that, here is Morgan Campbell, and I'm glad to be in conversation with him.
I appreciate it. I didn't know where you were going to take it, but that particular paragraph stands out to a lot of people. I did a presentation in Cleveland last summer with Coley Harvey, who was with ESPN back then, now he's with CBS Sports. Same thing, and I didn't prompt him, I didn't put him up to it. He chose that paragraph. But we're not here to talk about football directly. It's Black Music Month. We're talking about music, and if you've read my book, and I hope you do, there's a whole chapter in it called Living with Music, which obviously I borrowed from Ralph Ellison. He has a collection of essays called Living with Music. The thing you know about Ralph Ellison is that he was a classically trained musician before he was a writer. And so now, Augustus, your book has a whole deep, long, wide chapter on Ralph Ellison. You mentioned your family too. Your mom was a classical pianist, and Ralph Ellison was a classical, he's a trumpet player. What I want to know from you is what connections you see between their art, their music, and Ellison's writing, their art and your writing.
Yeah, that's a great question. In some ways, the chapter on Ellison, in particular that section on living with music, also has a kind of eerie resonance in my life, in part because literally right before we went into quarantine for the pandemic, I signed a contract for my job in New York, which I had before I moved here. And I was living in Maryland doing a postdoc, and then when I finished the postdoc, I did my whole first year in Maryland teaching on Zoom for the job in New York. When I finally moved to New York in November 2020, when I was living in Harlem, and I was living like right on Malcolm X Boulevard. Yeah, 142nd Street, Malcolm X Boulevard. Ironically, also living in a building called the Savoy, which I mean is certainly like in terms of jazz music history, the Savoy was like a club where people stand there. But the reason I'm saying it was kind of scary when I moved there and was in the process of getting my book published is that in Living with Music, Ralph Ellison's short story or short essay, he tells a story about how he had moved to Harlem and he was constantly bombarded with like noise. So outside of his basement floor apartment, there was a drunk who all used to yell and scream, and it kept him from being able to write. And then above him was a woman who would always sing really loud. We said, you know, like, her voice was not always the best, but it wasn't like she was always terrible. And so he kind of makes it to say, like, I could never get my writing done, but at the same time, I felt like this woman who lived above me helped me really understand craft. The reason why I'm saying that it was scary is because when I moved into my apartment in Harlem, above me, there was a woman and a man who always sang opera. And I was like, I mean, my life could not be goes without, and of course I'm living right on Malcolm X Boulevard where it's totally noisy, like all the time. So it almost felt like I was living with music. But I think also, you know, in terms of like my personal life and certainly my mother, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, although my mother was a classical trained pianist but was not doing that as a total vocation, I do think that I learned from her the importance of practice. Okay? And in particular, you know, certainly as a writer, that so much of your writing is a practice of constantly, you know, revision and, you know, sometimes, you know, in order to be a good writer, sometimes all the time in order to be a good writer, you need to be a good reader. And so the other part of this is also that my mother and my father were both preachers. So reading and writing were very much integral to the notion of like what craft meant. And also for me, at least coming from my mother, the fact of her being a classically trained pianist also meant that in my own work, I have deep investments in wanting the work to sing. So in those ways, yeah, I think my mother's, you know, fidelity to craft helped me to kind of understand the importance of it. Yeah. I guess for me, my question to you is you know, so for me, it's my matrilineal line that helps me understand craft. But in your book, it's your patrilineal line, right? So it's your.
My mom's dad.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Your matrilineal line. That's right. Yeah, your matrilineal line in terms of your grandfather. So I guess for me, I kind of have a similar question where I want to know something about craft, but also given the fact of the genre of music that your grandfather was playing, do you understand your work as a journalist as a kind of jazz?
Okay. One, yeah, I do think sometimes of the parallels, you know, between me and my grandfather in the sense that we both played keyboards for a living, you know. Two, this will show you how bright I am. Okay? So the whole chapter in my book, Living with Music, if you haven't read it already, I hope you get a chance to read it, is about the fact that music in my family wasn't just something that people do, it was the family business, right? And when I say I owe my life to black music, I'm not exaggerating, okay? Because my grandparents, they lived in Chicago. They knew Canada existed. Like my grandfather was good friends with Oscar Peterson. You know, he used to play opposite Oscar in Chicago, in Indianapolis. But the idea of coming to Canada never crossed his mind until he started getting booked here. And when he started getting booked here, he fell in love with the city, and then they moved here. And my parents, they were back in Chicago, late 60s. They were like, we're not sure we even want to have kids here. It's a military draft. Why do we want to have a son for them to send him to Vietnam to die? We might have one kid here. I'm kid number 3. And so if my parents had stayed in Chicago, it would have been what? Point is, if it wasn't for black music, if it wasn't for jazz, there's no reason for Canada even to wind up on anyone's radar in my family. Now, this chapter, and again, to show you how smart I am, this chapter, Living with Music, and this theme I keep bringing up in the book is about how music is sort of, it's this passion, this craft, this calling from different people in my family across generations, but it's also an unforgiving grind, right? And each musician in the family loves the craft but hates the business, okay? So my grandfather now, my youngest uncle, so they have 4 kids. The first 3 were not really interested in music. My grandparents were very happy with that. My youngest uncle, who lives here in Toronto, he's probably 10 years younger than the rest of the other kids. He grew up a little bit different, and they would just give him instruments. So my Uncle Jeff has been a professional musician literally for, he's 72, been a professional musician since he was 16. He's never had a lesson. He just always had instruments. But when he got ready to become a professional musician, my grandpa sat him down and said, "You don't want to do this. It's too stressful. It's too unsteady. You're not going to make. You might make a living, but you're also going to go crazy." Quiet, Dad. I'm going to become a rock star. So now, like I said, he's still playing. He's in Western Michigan right now with the Guess Who, Bert Cummings. American Woman. He plays bass with them. And then my sister, when she was in high school, I actually witnessed this conversation where my uncle came over and sat her down and was like, "You don't want to do this, not for a living." And my sister was like, "I don't feel like pushing a pencil my whole life." And he's like, "Sometimes pushing a pencil is better than dealing with what we deal with." And so I took all that in, and I decided that for me, like, music is good to do in 7th grade band, 8th grade band, whatever, but I'm not going to do it for a living because it's too stressful. But now here I am as a writer, which is, I promise you, no less stressful, no more stable. It is frying pan to fire. It makes no difference. But that's the bigger point is, yes, especially as a deadline writer, like when I was covering Major League Baseball for the Toronto Star, like you're writing every single night on deadline. And sort of the easy way to do that is just to talk about what happened in the game. But for me, it was always very important to write even these game stories that are going to disappear, from people's consciousness after 12 hours. Like, write a story that sings, and that was really important to me. Even 5 guys from 5 outlets writing about the same game, I want my story to read differently. I want to tell a story, not just report on a baseball game or a boxing match or whatever. Now, was I thinking about my grandfather consciously during? No, not necessarily. But it's just one of these parallels that winds up popping up. And so that was where that came from. I appreciate no one has asked that question yet. I appreciate that question. So for the folks that haven't read Stay Black and Die, there's also a big chapter on Marvin Gaye. And I learned so many things about Marvin Gaye that I hadn't necessarily known. Like, I didn't know his family was from Lexington, Kentucky. So I'm trying to figure out if he's related to the sprinter, Tyson Gaye, because Tyson Gaye is from Lexington, Kentucky. What I want to ask you about is, you mentioned this lyric in Trouble Man a couple times. And I've gone back and forth, like with editors in my book, about song lyrics. Because often the internet says one thing, but your ear says something else. And they're trying to tell you to trust the internet. And you're trying to tell them to trust their ear. And you mentioned this lyric in Trouble Man, where he either says, "I come up hard," or "I come apart." My question to you is, did you ever get to the bottom of the come up hard versus come apart mystery, and what did that answer tell you?
Yes, so in some ways, the question of Marvin Gaye is also interesting in terms of kind of genealogy, because my father my mother was classically trained, and then my father really primarily only played black vernacular music. So growing up, a mode of bonding between my father and I was basically Motown 25 on VHS. So this is the first recording of Michael Jackson doing the moonwalk.
Yes.
And also Marvin Gaye's on there singing what's going on, but also in the kind of celebration, there's an embodied simulation of Ernie Barnes' Sugar Shack with dancers, which is the cover of the I Want You album. And so Marvin Gaye had been in my mind for a long time, and particularly Trouble Man, I had been really interested precisely in this question of like how Trouble Man can kind of maybe map on, help us understand the whims of his childhood. So to your point, in the chapter, I basically say that like when I for all the years I've been listening to Trouble Man, it sounded like he said, "I come apart, baby," and then and then you you know, you do your Google search XYZ, and it turns out that these things I come up hard. And so in the chapter, I'm really kind of figuring out, like, does one lead to the other? Like, does coming up hard render coming up hard? But what's also interesting is that Marvin Gaye tells a story about how when he first recorded Trouble Man, he didn't release the lyrics. And then the lyrics don't get released for almost a decade until he joins, I believe, CBS Records. And he says, you know, like, I like the idea of people, I like the idea of mystery. Like, I like the idea of people guessing what I'm singing, right? So, I mean, in those ways, I mean, I take the up hard as the kind of standard, but I think he totally sounds like he's sang up hard, right? And I think also with Marvin Gaye, it kind of puts him in a long line of black musicians who sometimes you don't understand what they're saying. So I mean, certainly Michael Jackson, Nina Simone, in certain iterations. Yeah, D'Angelo, certainly on Black Messiah, D'Angelo, right? So it's kind of a long tradition of people, you're not really knowing what people are saying. It's also funny, like, how there are some songs that to me sound like obvious lyrics, but people also misconstrue them. So, like, for some reason, people have always thought that the lyrics for Optimistic were weird. The song sounds like this is optimistic.
You can win as long as you keep your head together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, well, long as you keep, long as you keep dancing, right? I don't know why people have been confused by those lyrics, but for some reason people have been confused by them. I think, you know, to me, one of the most glaring moments is I'm going to curse because of the song. But, you know, Ja Rule's I'm Real.
With J-Lo?
Yeah, with J-Lo.
Yes.
So, you know, he begins the song saying, what's my motherfucking name? And she says, R-U-L-E. And people thought she was asking, R-U-L-E. And I'm like, well, he asked what his name is. Why wouldn't she say Rule, R-U-L-E? Like, it's amazing to me. I'm like, people really were confused, right? So I mean, again, it's like a long line, a long tradition of in black music of people being confused by lyrics. And Marvin Gaye to me is just like another one of those people.
Wait, before you ask your next question, can I add my experience to that? Okay. All right, we got any hip hop heads here? Hip hop fans, all right. Jay Dilla fans. Okay, so you know so far to go that instrumental, right? And the thing about that instrumental that blows my mind is that the only person involved in that instrumental that's still alive is the old guy, Ron Isley, right?
Yeah.
D'Angelo, dead. Jay Dilla died at 30, right? But that song samples a song called "Don't Say Goodnight, It's Time for Love" by the Isley Brothers. Okay, so now I reference that song in my book. It's a chapter called the 90-minute slow jam tape. Okay, and you know, children of the 90s, you remember what it was like to make a slow jam tape, right? 45 minutes aside. And I reference that song because Ron Isley comes out and he says, I want to love you over and over again. I want to see what you're like in bed. Because he does his own call and his own response. Right. Over and over. So I write that. Okay, we get the fact check now in the book. So they're Googling. I get this note from the editor. And they're like, yeah, I think you got, the editor's telling me, I think you got this lyric wrong. Like, what are you talking about? So look, the internet says, Ronald Isley says, I want to see what your life can be. So on the one hand, again, there's the ear test. There's what your ear tells you, right? But there's also the idea that like people on the internet will gaslight you in the service of like trying to save Ronald Isley's reputation, right? Like if you know the Isley Brothers, especially like mid-70s through mid-80s discography, you'll know that "See What You're Like in Bed" is much more in line with everything else they did than "See What Your Life Can Be," right? These are guys that had a song called "Between the Sheets," "Keep Touching Me,"
Hello.
Hello, it's me. I Need Your Body, right? And you think Ronald...
Sexuality?
Yes!
Like so many, yeah.
And you think he's going to draw the line and see what your life can be? There's no way. So I have to say this, like as a writer that's in the black music, it helps to really be into it and sort of defend the work against, not against Eddie. Eddie was a good guy, but he just wasn't, he didn't have the cultural capital to deal with it. He wasn't ready for raunchy Ron Isley, a few people are, right? So I had to sort of draw the line. Anyway, all right, on to your question.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, totally spot on. When I was reading, it also, again, ways that our lives map onto each other. You're narrating a lot of time spent in the car. And in many ways, some of my most vivid music memories are in the car. I mean, I remember my mother's like mustard yellow Volvo. I remember my dad's sky blue Saab. You know, like my father playing Shirley Caesar. My mother playing, you know, like top 40 R&B. So I guess I was interested in hearing you talk a bit about what you were listening to in cars.
So, even though the musicians are all on my mom's side of the family, my dad is the one that taught me how to listen to music. My dad is like, you gotta listen to the bass line first, and you can go up from there or down from there, but like, first thing you gotta do is listen to what the bass line is doing, and that'll tell you everything you need to know about the song. And so yeah, a lot of my adolescence was just car rides to places with my dad, because my mom didn't drive. So me and my dad driving to Grand Rapids, Michigan, to visit his family. Me and my dad driving to Chicago. Me and my dad driving to football games, whatever. You know, so sometimes he'd let me listen to rap. It would be like acclaimed or whatever. My dad would let me listen to rap in his presence as long as it was like appropriately pro-black, right? So if it was Public Enemy or acclaimed, cool. Like anybody else, no. But I'll give you an example, like from the book, and I did not put music in this chapter only because so much of what was, I'll tell you why. The chapter is called Chicago 1992 Equipment for Living, and it focuses on this trip. Me and my dad, we go to Chicago, and he introduces me to his secret half-sister. 15 years old, I knew my dad had a half-brother, the half-brother was older. He introduces me to this half-sister who was younger. And so her presence tells me a lot about his dad. His dad was a difficult guy. Could be charming, except when he was drinking. The drinking was 33% of his life. Point is, you asked me about that trip. We drove from Toronto to Chicago, and like the songs that were on the radio, felt like it was 5 songs on the radio that summer. She's playing Hard to Get. High Five. These guys might be too young to remember this. It's playing Hard to Get, High Five. That's the Babyface and Tony Braxton song from Boomerang.
Okay.
Give You My Love. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Great soundtrack.
Yes. Yes. That was the era of the soundtracks every summer, man. So, playing Hard to Get, Give You My Love, Give You My Heart, and then the other 2 songs, especially as we got closer to Chicago, Slow Dance by R. Kelly.
I would say He Shall Not Be Named.
And Honey Love by He Who Shall Not Be Named. And so like, if I was to add a soundtrack to that chapter, and that chapter is my dad taking me to these different spots in Chicago, just teaching me stuff about being black, surviving as a black young man in the society. Even though I grew up in Canada, he was like, there's just stuff you need to know no matter where you are, but I can only teach it to you here. And we had this big like a shopping trip. We went to these different shops on 87th Street in Chicago. That's where Colin's from. And any place we stopped after we went to these 3 or 4 places to buy stuff, he starts drilling me on like, well, all right, who greeted you when you came to the store? What color was the guy? Black guy. Who took the money at the cash register? Chinese guy, Asian guy. Perfect. Next door, what happened? Same thing. Next door, what happened? Same thing. And I was like, I know he was leading me somewhere. I wasn't going to try to answer the question for him, but he was like, look, every single place we go to is the same setup. And I'm going to curse here because that's how he writes it. That's how I write it in the books. I said it all the time. Like any place you go to, it's the same thing. You get a nigga to greet you at the door. And when it's time to handle the money, here comes, what my dad would call an Arab. Here comes an Arab. Here comes a Korean guy. So you got to ask yourself: do you want to shop at places where they don't let black folks touch the money? Right? And that sat with me. It sits with me now. If I'm with my wife at a hairdresser, I'm like, hey, who's at the cash register? And who got their pictures on the wall talking about she steals, right? Point is, if that chapter had a soundtrack, it would have been he who shall not be named twice, high five, Babyface and Tony Braxton, and maybe this is very Twister, who back then was Tongue Twister, and his claim to fame was he was the world's fastest rapper. He was from Chicago. Yes. So on that trip, I bought a tape at Ford City Mall for the Chicagoans watching. And the tape was Run Off at the Mouth. He had his single on the radio was called Rat-a-Tat-Tat. So there's somebody out there listening that remembers Rat-a-Tat-Tat from Tongue Twister. So that would have been the soundtrack in the car to that chapter. I'm sorry, yes, I had a question for you. Okay. Well, perfect. This is a good segue because now we mentioned rap. We're here in Toronto. Where a pro-slavery rapper just put out 3 albums in a day. Right? And celebrated because he got more streams than Michael Jackson. But there's no multi-city stadium tour to prove that those streams come from real people that are willing to pay money to go see you. Meanwhile, his nemesis put out an album at the Super Bowl, sold out stadiums in every city, including this one. Twice. Yeah, he added dates. Okay.
And it was also the weekend of Father's Day.
Yes. But he makes an appearance in your book, a whole chapter. And so you're talking about To Pimp a Butterfly. That album came out 2014 or 15? Okay. In just a sentence, in a sentence you describe the album, you said it's his attempt to love blackness amid terror. And that was 11 years ago. You could argue that this is the indicative of the effed up place we were always in, where like police brutality was the main terror, but at least we still had a Voting Rights Act. So my question to you is like, how important is it or should it be for somebody musically to step up and offer that same type of strident defense of blackness amid the terror we are facing right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. To try to answer that succinctly. There's a way that some of my book is trying to argue, like to reconceptualize our heroes, in a way. And some of that is just to say that that the people that we revere are people, right? So this kind of reverence and veneration sometimes clouds like certain kinds of judgments that we have. And I find Kendrick Lamar really, really interesting, in part because the album comes out in 2015, and I couldn't really write about it for almost 5 years. Because the other thing too is that it comes out in, that was also just a weird moment musically, because that's 2015, the following year is an election year, and Beyonce Lemonade comes out that spring. So in the span of 2 years, kind of really, really important culturally shifting albums come out amid political upheaval in the States. And so I felt like I couldn't really write about it immediately, in part because, especially with Lemonade, well, really both of them, but Lemonade in particular, the album dropped at midnight, and people have think pieces about it that afternoon. like that, like by 9 o'clock. I mean, it has to have been like in terms of album drops, like the most written about album in that short span of time, like in history. So with some time and being to kind of sit with the album, I think what emerges from the album, and he says this, is that in some ways, for him, and certainly also because he's a Gemini, he kind of was trying to ride the wave of like, should I be a pimp or a butterfly? Like, how do I kind of, should I pimp my career towards certain kinds of ends? Or, in the chapter I think a lot about notions of flight and, especially in the All Right video where he flies in the video. So all that to say, the question of, someone who can offer striking critique. I mean, I think in some ways, his goal of offering a kind of really striking critique is happening at the Super Bowl, right? But of course, it's also interesting because at the Super Bowl, there's that breakout moment where the dancer runs onto the field with these 2 flags, right? And ends up basically getting tackled by police, right? So even though it's not necessarily that Kendrick Lamar like perpetrates that kind of political moment around, I think it was Palestine and Sudan, right? He does offer the stage for it to happen alongside Serena Williams crip walking, which is obviously a reference to the other rapper that you also don't name, right? Or for that matter, the fact that she, I believe, owns stake in the Toronto Tempo, the new WNBA team, right? So it's like all the kind of shade of those moves, right? But again, I think I opened the question or response by talking about reconceptualizing our heroes because it's in some ways it's also kind of a mark of how capitalism works. Because like for example, Jay-Z early in his career is very different than Jay-Z now, where like there are all these desires to boycott Target, and then he starts a big Target deal, right? So I mean, in some ways, maybe the kind of strident critique that we're looking for is probably going to come from like underground rappers, right? So I think a lot about the fact of No Name having a book club, right? And what does it mean that she's also sending books to people who are incarcerated? So yeah, I mean, because the book is kind of really pushing back on like how we kind of worship and revere heroes, I don't know if we can always look to people who have ascended certain kinds of class ranks to kind of be because they have a bottom line too, right? But so maybe again, like we're really going to find it in underground rappers, certainly queer and trans rappers, or again people who kind of, in the case of No Name in particular, who like make a name through rap and hip hop, and then take a radical shift. Because I think she started since she started the book. I don't think she's released an album, maybe an EP, right? But but like takes a radical shift and decides to really like sew back into the community, both by way of like reading and literacy, but also by educating people behind bars, right? So I guess that would be my answer to the question. Something that also resonated with me, and perhaps I can tell the story in a separate moment, is that I was really intrigued by the moment of the funeral where Dana is being told to sing.
Yes.
The reason why I'm interested in that is because when my mother passed away, I had a similar moment.
Okay.
By a relative by marriage. I said it on purpose. Relative by marriage, who like I had never met. Right? And so I guess I'm also interested in what kind of music have you found has been helpful or like consoling for you in moments of grief? Because I think for me, for what it's worth, I'm writing a book right now about Roberta Flack. And there's a really interesting moment in a book by a scholar named Tina Campt, where she talks about how when her mother died, at the repast they played Killing Me Softly. right?
Yeah.
So I'm also interested, especially given that moment that I'm like totally not so into a thing that happened to me. What kind of music consoles you in moments of grief?
Oh, good question. Good question. That's a really good question. I don't try to do anything. I just sort of come back to the music of the moment. So I'll give you two examples. Like one album is always going to stick with me. I'm trying not to cry. If my sister were here, she would cry. Because like the year my dad died, that was September of 1994. Mary J. Blige had an album that fall. My life. And what I remember just about that first full year without my dad is that my sister was just playing that album constantly. And two songs that always take me right back there. Never Want to Live Without You and You Gotta Believe It. Automatic takes me right back. I don't know if it's consolation or wallowing or whatever, because I don't mind it, but I hear those songs, and sometimes I seek out those songs and just remember what it was like to be 17, dealing with this. And then just like the night my grandfather died, so I'm like, the thing about my grandfather is you read the book, like he played a lot of sessions, he played a lot of clubs, he did not record a lot, right? And other musicians, he for whatever reason didn't regret it, but other musicians sort of regretted that for him. Like I would talk to people around here that knew him, like Josie, the pianist, like, yeah, I knew your grandpa, I know your grandpa. You should record it, And so I spent the night that he died. I got word called. My mom called me about 10 at night, and I tried to sleep, and I couldn't sleep, and I just woke up and was just looking all over down the internet for songs that he was on. So like, I'm So Proud, Curtis Mayfield, The Impressions, that's my grandfather's playing Celeste. The first few notes you hear, the last notes you hear. So if you watch like Bronx Tale, it's like, okay. But the stuff you do with like Eddie Johnson in Chicago. So the passage in the book where I'm talking about listening to him playing the piano, and that strong piano is in between the bass and the melody. That came from like that all-nighter, just me going all the way down the internet looking for grandpa's music. So I wasn't necessarily looking to just, for consolation during this time of grief. It was just a reflex. But again, it speaks to the ways in which like music is intertwined, in my family's lives. And like again, without music, I don't know where we'd be. Like if my grandma was a teacher or whatever, and like if you guys get to read the book, like it's a lot in terms of how my grandfather actually becomes a musician. I'm not going to spoil it, but basically his family bet the whole family's entire future on him. It's a 10-year-old boy playing piano. Most of them got kids in lessons or whatever. You don't build plans around a 10-year-old becoming a professional at anything. They were like, our whole future is on you. 10-year-old Claude. Have fun. And so, it was the springboard, that brought us to Canada. It was, they never got rich or whatever. You made a living playing jazz piano. That's not an easy thing to do. But I just, it was weird. I didn't go looking for gospel necessarily, though now I might. But that night, so much of it is this situation specific. And that night, it was just trying to find songs that he had played on. And it brought me, so it was Eddie Johnson tracks. And to Curtis Mayfield and The Impressions. To Betty Everett. Like that. Let me think. Now, those are the questions I have for you. I see Cameron's been jotting notes furiously all night. So there's a point in the program where we turn the microphone to y'all, because if y'all have questions, y'all are free to ask questions. I see you've been writing all night, so I'm handing you this mic.
Alright. What's up, y'all? Yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation. I think I had questions in mind about the book, but I think watching you all in conversation, I'm thinking about a couple of things. One for you, Augustus, like, now that you've been in Canada for how many years now? So that's, I've been here one year longer, right? And one of the things I've been thinking about is like how the cultural production around, like even music, like let's take music for example. Like being here, being in a different context for like where music, black culture happens and things like that in different ways. How is that coming back? How does that come back into how you were thinking about black music production, black culture production? Like for me, it feels expansive. You know, it's very diasporic, globally diasporic here, whatever, but like how, that's what it feels like for me, but I'm curious about how it feels like for you.
Let me answer that,
Yep.
so that we don't forget. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, in a former life I sang, so in some ways it's not, I think you're right, you know, music is very porous even when we think about borders, right? You know, so it's interesting we're talking because recently, I mean, I think maybe last night on TikTok, Deborah Cox was singing her part on We Can't Be Friends with Ara, which is I think on like her second studio album. And it's ironic to hear her singing that because when I was in undergrad, I was in an a cappella group, and before I joined, they arranged that song, right? So that's just an example, right? And at the same time that happened on TikTok last night, you know, Whitney Houston has kind of been in the ether again behind a confession that was made by Oprah. And this morning when I opened up Facebook to post about this, I'm going to forget the producer's name, but he posted a video of her hearing for the first time, same script, different cast, which she sings with Deborah Cox, right? So to me, that's just like a very kind of example in miniature, as recently as yesterday and today, of like how, you know, Deborah Cox is Canadian, Whitney Houston is American. You know, the music is transcendent, even insofar as like, We Can't Be Friends is something that my fellow group sang in Philadelphia, right? And Whitney Houston is listening to the demo for Same Script, Different Cast, which she's going to eventually sing with Deborah Cox, right? So in those ways, like, it's always been porous. And I think too, you know, for what it's worth, certainly with my mother being a classically trained pianist, you know, like, she's training in, you know, Beethoven, and right, it's all transcendent insofar as like, you know, the border really doesn't matter, right? So I think in those ways, you know, and I think you're right too, like the ear test always, if the ear has been trained properly, right, the ear test is always going to show that like you're listening to more than just one thing, or more than what you think is being played.
Another question? Go.
When you were talking about lyrics, when you're talking about lyrics, this is more of a comment. One of the lyrics that I remember that people screw up is Rob Bass, recently passed away, so rest in peace, Rob Bass. It takes two, it can't stand sex, yes, and people think it's can't stand sex, yes, and that's what I wanted to say. But I also wanted to just ask a general question, being that World Cup is in the city. Do you happen to know how they choose the music for World Cup? I remember one of the World Cups, Chaos had waving the flag, and this World Cup it's true and Bernie Moore with Da Da. And I was just curious to know if you happen to know how they choose the songs and what the impact was
Yeah. I remember I was studying in South Africa in 2006, which is right ahead of World Cup in South Africa. And in terms of just sonically, what I do remember is that they had those, they call them vuvuzelas, like And that was a really like, I mean, they really kind of wanted to try to cite like noise pollution because they were so loud. So I mean, that's like one sonic movie that I feel like is relevant to the question of World Cup, but actually I really don't know. You know, maybe it's interesting to think about the fact that like, you know, they choose a Burna Boy song, and I was reading somewhere that like they were projecting that African countries were not going to do well this World Cup, and they actually have overperformed. So, you know, maybe there's some kind of coincidental or serendipitous thing around that. But yeah, in terms of how they choose, I have no idea.
I think we have time for one more question. Cam?
Let's go.
All right, so I read the book. Right, so great book. I see it in like two parts. Like, yeah, we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I really appreciated, and this is what I reached out to you about, was about the voice, right? The voices, right? You have I grew up in Georgia, from the States. I hear the way that people talk here, and it's very like, it's just different, right? The cultural references are different. So when I heard and when I read the dialogue in the book, I'm hearing voices that feel like home, right? So I wanted to, I guess, get a sense of like, there was some insistence on that part, but thinking about, as people read it, what do you want people to understand about kind of Black American, African American culture in this context, and vice versa? What would you want Black folks in the States to understand about Blackness in this context?
Okay, a couple things. One, if I was not publishing this book in Canada, it would read a little bit differently. Only in the sense that I don't write for other people. When I think about like my audience, my hypothetical reader is someone just like me and my friends. Okay? And especially like my family, they don't need the fine points of African American speech explained to them. But I made a couple of very intentional detours in this book just to explain Black American speech. And I still know like white people, white Canadians, that come to me at these events and say, oh yeah, your dad's grammar. No, we're not talking about dad's grammar. Right? What is this? I explained to you in the book African American vernacular English, but it does connect with the theme tonight because when I hear Black Americans from different parts of the country speak, what I hear in the speech more than anything is the music. I hear the music in the speech. And you know, it's different, especially because like we growing up get bombarded with these messages about how our language is second rate. You don't have language, you have slang. Y'all don't understand grammar and usage and blah 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 blah. And I push back against that, and I'll defend Black American English, African American vernacular English every time, right? And so one of the things up here is that it was in fashion for a while, before like the Toronto accent became a thing. There was a while when like affecting an American accent was a thing among the Black kids around here. So maybe like 20 years ago. And like for me, I could always tell like who was putting it on. Like, I hear you trying to talk. You don't sound like my uncle. You sound like my mom. You don't sound like my dad. Right? I grew up with them and I can't even affect their accent. I would sound like an idiot. Right? Which is why Kendrick told the rapper who shall not be named, what did he tell him?
You can't say that word anymore.
Before that, there's no accent you can sell me, right? But again, we do live now around a group of people that think having a handle on AAVE only means just spamming the N-word. But again, this is very superficial, right? Like, you know, I mentioned in the book about like, I know there's a few Black Americans here, I know some of y'all aren't, but like, what the word behind means. You know, it might mean physically behind, but it might also mean as a result of. Can't believe you went to jail behind that. Right? But these are things that you only pick up if you have an ear. So the part of what you're hearing, part of what you notice in the way I transmit speech, like my dad's speech, my mom's speech, my uncle's speech, is the same thing that makes us good at music. And my family is just ear. I have an ear, and all I wanted to do was make it sound exactly like it sounded. Because I knew for people like you and like you would get And other people, they might need explaining. I'm not necessarily going to explain it because this is my parents speaking in their first language. But again, what I hear in that language is the music, and the thing that allows me to hear it and write it the way it sounds in a way that makes sense to you being from Georgia is the fact that, like, whether it's writing or music or learning a new language, thing that allows you to do that much more so than mastering it in written form is having an ear. So I think that's everything. I really want to thank you guys for coming out. I appreciate y'all taking the time again. Like, there's a million things going on right now. You could be in a sports bar watching soccer, pretending I don't know who's playing right now, but you could be, you know, hanging out with their fans. But you're here with us, talking black music with two black writers. I appreciate it, and we'll see y'all next time. Thank you.